In December of 2019, a man named David Nielsen filed a complaint with the tax authorities, and the number in it was $100 billion. He filed it with the Internal Revenue Service, and Nielsen was not a critic or an activist. He was a senior portfolio manager at Ensign Peak Advisors, which is the investment arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he had spent years inside it looking at the balance. On the 16th of December, the Washington Post published the story, and within about a day, the phrase $100 billion church was on every screen in the English-speaking world. So, is the Latter-day Saint Church really the richest church in America? I'm going to answer that tonight with actual numbers, and I want to tell you up front that the answer is not a clean defense.
There is a piece of this where the church was straightforwardly in the wrong, admitted it, and paid a fine. And I am going to walk you through that part without softening it. One quick thing, and it is related. Working out what a number actually means takes a great deal longer than repeating it does. Subscribing is what buys that time on a channel this size. Now, the number. The short answer is yes and no, and by the end, I will have told you exactly which parts are yes. Getting there means the actual figures rather than the headline one. What the Securities and Exchange Commission charged in 2023, and what the church did about it, and the strongest version of the criticism, which is a good deal stronger than most members think it is. Start with the number itself, because the reporting on it has been genuinely confusing.
Ensign Peak Advisors is the church's investment manager. It sits in Salt Lake City. It has been running since the late 1990s, and its job is to manage the surplus. Tithing comes in. The church's operating budget goes out, and what is left over goes to Ensign Peak, which invests it. That is the whole model, and it is not exotic. Universities do it, foundations do it, sovereign states do it. What Nielsen alleged in 2019 was that this fund had grown to roughly $100 billion, that it had never made a charitable distribution during his time there, and that it had been built from tithing surplus, while being described to members in general terms that did not convey the scale. Now, the interesting thing about the 100 billion figure is what has happened to it since. It stopped being a leak. Because since 2020, Ensign Peak has filed a single quarterly report with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the form known as a 13F, which any institutional manager holding more than a set amount of American-listed stock has to file. Anyone can download it, and what it shows, quarter after quarter, is a portfolio of American-listed equities running in the tens of billions of dollars, in the range above 50 billion. Sit with that. The most explosive financial claim ever made about this church is now partly checkable on a government website by anybody with an internet connection and 10 minutes. But that filing is also the reason people talk past each other about the total. So let me be precise. A 13F only shows one category of asset. It shows publicly traded American stock. It does not show bonds. It does not show cash. It does not show foreign holdings, private equity, real estate, farmland, or operating businesses. So the 50-something billion in that filing is a floor for one slice, not a total. What else is there? Real estate at serious scale. Deseret ranches in Central Florida
runs to roughly 290,000 acres, which puts it among the largest ranches in the United States. There is farmland across several countries. There is City Creek Center, the shopping and residential development in downtown Salt Lake City that opened in 2012 at a reported cost of around $1.5 billion. There are insurance and media holdings. There are thousands of meeting houses and hundreds of temples, though those are the opposite of liquid because nobody is selling a temple.
So what is the real total?
Nobody outside the institution knows precisely, and that is a deliberate situation. The church does not publish financial statements in the United States because, as a religious organization, it is not required to.
It did publish them annually until 1959. It stopped. It does publish in the United Kingdom and in Canada, where the law makes it, which is how outside analysts get some of their footholds. The most serious independent attempt is a volunteer project called the Widow's Mite Report, run by members with finance backgrounds, which builds estimates from the public filings and the foreign disclosures. Their published estimates of total assets have run in the region of $200 billion. That is an estimate by outsiders working from partial data, and I am labeling it as such rather than reporting it as a fact. Now the part where the church was in the wrong, and I am not going to skate over it. On the 21st of February, 2023, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced a settlement. It charged Ensign Peak advisors, and it charged the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints itself over the way those filings had been handled between 1997 and 2019. Here is what they did. Rather than file 113F in Ensign Peak's name, they filed through 13 separate shell companies, limited liability companies with their own names and their own addresses, with church employees as the signatories, several of whom the SEC said did not really know what they were signing. The effect, and according to the SEC, the intent, was to obscure the size of the portfolio so that no observer could add it up. The penalty was $5 million. $4 million from Ensign Peak, $1 million from the church. The church issued a statement. It said it had relied on legal counsel in setting up the structure, that it regretted the mistakes, and that it had been filing a single consolidated report since 2019. And the reason the church is given for wanting the portfolio obscured in the first place is the part I find hardest to defend. The concern was that if members saw the size of the reserve, they might conclude their contributions were not needed and stop giving. I want to be plain about that. That is a bad reason. Not a legal argument, not a technicality. It is an institution deciding that its own members could not be trusted with a true picture of the institution's finances. And it produced exactly the outcome anyone could have predicted, which is that when the number finally came out, it came out through a whistleblower and a newspaper, instead of through an annual report, and it landed like a scandal instead of like an accounting entry. $5 million is a rounding error against $100 billion. The credibility cost was not. Right. So now the harder question, and this is where I think most of the public conversation goes wrong in both directions. Is a $100 billion reserve by itself a scandal? Think about how an endowment works, because the word reserve is doing real work here. The model is that you do not spend the principal. You invest it, and you spend a portion of the returns, which means the fund keeps generating money indefinitely instead of being consumed. Harvard University runs an endowment in the region of $50 billion. Yale
is in the neighborhood of 40. Nobody writes headlines calling Harvard the richest school in America as an accusation, because everyone understands what an endowment is for. It is a machine for turning one large sum into a permanent income. So the size of a fund on its own tells you almost nothing about whether an organization is behaving well. The questions that actually matter are what it spends, what the fund is for, and whether it will ever be drawn down. So what does this church spend? Start with the one it publishes. Every year the church issues a report on its humanitarian and welfare work with a dollar figure attached. In 2021, that figure was in the region of $900 million. In 2022, it passed $1 billion. In 2023, it was reported above $1.3 billion. Before 2020, those annual figures ran in the hundreds of millions. So humanitarian spending has multiplied several times over in a handful of years. And I will come back to the timing of that, because the timing is interesting. Those are the church's own published numbers, and you should weigh them accordingly. They are not audited by anyone outside the institution. That is a fair caveat, and I will make it myself before a critic does. But humanitarian aid is the smaller line, and any honest accounting has to say so. The bulk of what this church spends money on is running itself, building and maintaining tens of thousands of meeting houses, building temples, and it has more than 100 of them announced or under construction right now, at costs that run well into the tens of millions each. Education, which includes the Brigham Young University system, and a global network of seminaries and institutes that is enormous and heavily subsidized. The missionary program, with tens of thousands of missionaries in the field, and the welfare system, the storehouses and employment centers, and the church's own farms and canneries. Where does that money come from? Tithing, principally. Members are asked for 10% of their income. Outside analysts working from the available disclosures put annual tithing revenue somewhere in the region of $7 billion. The church does not confirm a figure. And before the criticism, you need to know how the money actually arrives, because outsiders picture this wrong too. There is no collection plate. Nobody passes anything in a Latter-day Saint service. Tithing is paid privately by slip or online, and it is 10% of income, and the amount is entirely self-declared. Nobody audits a member. Nobody asks for a pay stub. Once a year there is a short meeting with the bishop, historically called tithing settlement, where the member is shown what the records say they paid and is asked one question: are you a full tithe payer? And whatever they answer is the answer. So the system runs almost entirely on the honor of the person paying, which is either a beautiful thing or a very effective one, depending on your mood. And honestly, it is both. Two things about it are not soft, though, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is a requirement for a temple recommend, so it is tied to the part of the religion members care about most, and it is taught as 10% regardless of what the 10% leaves you, which is where the real weight of the criticism sits. The volunteer analysts who tracked this church's money named their project after a widow. That was not an accident. The Widow's Mite report takes its name from Mark chapter 12, where Jesus watches wealthy people put large sums into the treasury, and then watches a poor widow put in 2 small coins, and says she gave more than all of them. because they gave out of their abundance, and she gave everything she had. That story is a compliment to the widow. It has never been read as a compliment to the treasury. Now let me build the criticism properly, because the fair version is much better than the version that goes viral. It is not that a church has money. It is not even that a church invests money. It goes like this. A church asks its members for 10% of their income, and it asks that of everyone, including members in the Philippines, and in Ghana, and in Guatemala, where 10% is not a line item. It is food. It teaches that paying it is a requirement for entering the temple, which is the center of the religion. It takes that money, spends what it needs, and puts the surplus into a fund that has grown to a size most national governments would envy. It then declines to tell those same members how large the fund is or what it is for, in the one country where it is not legally obliged to. And when the number does come out, it comes out because a former employee took documents to the federal government. And the strongest single line in the whole case is not from a critic at all. In 2020, Roger Clark, who ran Ensign Peak, spoke to the Wall Street Journal and said the reserve was there for hard times, and referenced the second coming as part of what it was being held for. I am not mocking that. It is a coherent religious position, and I understand exactly what he meant by it. But try saying it out loud to a family in Manila who pay their 10% every month. We are saving it for the end of the world. That is a very hard sentence to carry, and members should understand why it landed the way it did, rather than assuming everyone who winced was hostile. There was also litigation. In 2021, James Huntsman, from one of the most prominent families in Utah, sued the church, arguing that tithing funds had been improperly used on the City Creek development and asking for his donations back. The case ran through the federal courts for several years, and the church ultimately prevailed. But notice that the church winning a lawsuit is a statement about the law, not about whether the underlying concern was reasonable. Plenty of reasonable concerns lose in court. So, my honest answers, 4 of them. First, on the SEC case. Conceded. There is no version of this where the shell company structure was a good idea, and the reason behind it was worse than the structure. If the church had simply filed one report every quarter since 1997, the number would have grown in public, one filing at a time, and it would have been a business story rather than a scandal. They bought 22 years of quiet at the price of one very bad week, and it was a terrible trade. Second, on the size. On liquid investment reserves, yes. On the money you can actually count, this is almost certainly the wealthiest religious organization in the United States, and it is not particularly close. But the headline phrase, "Richest Church in America," is doing something sneaky, and it is worth catching. The Catholic Church in the United States almost certainly holds far more in total assets. Thousands of parishes, hundreds of schools, a vast hospital system, universities, cathedrals, land in every major city. What it does not have is a single balance sheet, because it is not one legal entity. It is thousands of separate dioceses and orders and corporations. So the comparison the headline invites is between one organization that can be added up and another that cannot. And the one that can be added up looks bigger. That is a measurement artifact, not a finding. Third, on hoarding. Here is the actual defense, and it is stronger than the one members usually reach for.
This church's growth is fastest in the places with the least money. Africa, the Philippines, Latin America, parts of Asia. Meanwhile, the majority of its revenue comes from the United States. If you project that forward, you get a global organization where most of the members cannot fund most of the operations, and the whole thing depends permanently on the prosperity of one country. A perpetual fund is the way you get out of that.
It is how you build a chapel in Ghana without needing the members in Ghana to pay for it. This year,
out of pockets that do not have it. That is also the church's own stated reason, and I think it is a real one. A church that plans in centuries is going to look strange to a culture that plans in quarters. Fourth, and here is where I stop defending. A reserve is only ever justified by being spent. A fund that grows forever and is never drawn down is not a reserve. It is a monument. And the honest observation, which I have not heard a single church spokesman make, is that the humanitarian spending figures started climbing steeply right around the time the 100 billion became public knowledge. 900 million, then past 1 billion, then past 1.3 billion, after years in the hundreds of millions. You can read that two ways. Either it is a coincidence of timing, or the scrutiny worked. I think it is mostly the second, and I do not think that is an embarrassment. Institutions respond to being watched. That is what accountability is. The awkward part is only that this church spent 22 years trying not to be watched, and then improved when it was. Which leaves one obvious question hanging, and members should be willing to ask it out loud. Why not just publish? Because the objection that publishing is impossible does not survive 5 minutes of looking. The Church of England's endowment is managed by a body called the Church Commissioners. It runs to something in the region of £10 billion, and they publish a full annual report every year. Holdings, returns, spending, the lot. Nobody's faith has collapsed. In the United States, there is an entire accreditation body, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, that religious organizations join voluntarily, specifically to prove they are not doing anything strange with the money. And this church already does it. In the United Kingdom and in Canada, it files public accounts, because those countries require it of charities. So the capability exists, the accounting exists, the people who prepare it exist. The only thing missing in the United States is the decision. I've never heard a defense of that decision that I found convincing. And I've gone looking. The best one I can construct, and I am constructing it because nobody has offered it to me, runs like this. Publish line items, and you invite permanent campaigning. Every group with a cause gets to point at a number and demand it be moved. Every year, forever. And an institution that is trying to plan in 50-year blocks ends up managed by whichever pressure worked that quarter. There is something real in that. Universities with public endowments live exactly that life. But weigh it against what the silence actually bought. It bought a whistleblower, a federal complaint, a front page, a $5 million settlement, an accusation of concealment that stuck.
and a generation of members who now hear the word tithing and think about $100 billion.
That is a very expensive quarter of privacy.
So here is the villain of tonight, and it is not David Nielsen, and it is not the Washington Post. It is the headline that presents a number without a purpose. $100 billion is not an argument, it is a quantity. It becomes an argument only when you attach a claim about what it is doing and what it is not doing. And almost none of the coverage did that work, because doing that work takes 20 minutes and a number takes 2 seconds. And there is a second one closer to home, and I would be a coward not to name it. Our own side's reflex when this comes up to change the subject to humanitarian aid and hope the conversation moves on. That reflex is why members get ambushed by this at work, because they have been handed a talking point instead of a picture. If you actually understand how a reserve works, and you can say out loud that the shell companies were indefensible, you will do far better in that conversation than anybody armed with a statistic about relief supplies. So, the title question straight. Is the Latter-day Saint Church really the richest church in America? On countable, liquid, investable wealth, almost certainly yes, and by a wide margin. In total assets across everything, probably not, because the Catholic Church in America is larger and simply cannot be totaled. And as a moral verdict, the number by itself tells you nothing at all. And anyone who hands you that number, as though it settled something, has skipped the only part of the conversation that was ever interesting. Which brings me to the question I actually want answered. And I do read these. If you pay tithing, or you used to, what is the one thing you would genuinely want to know about where it goes? Not a rhetorical jab, an actual question, the kind you would ask if someone from the finance department sat down across from you. Put it in the comments, plainly. I want to see what people really want to know, because I suspect it is not the 100 billion at all. And if there are enough good ones, I will go and chase the answers for a follow-up. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.